Okay. Hey, everyone. Welcome back to another live stream. Thanks for joining today. And if you're checking this out after the fact, glad you could join. In case you don't know me, I'm Taylor. Help gardeners explore low-cost regenerative growing techniques without the waste and unsustainability of a lot of modern gardening. And today, I'm talking about Bokashi. Bokashi-fermented organic matter. This is a super interesting topic to me. And if you're interested in reducing your waste, the waste that you generate as a household, your food waste specifically, then this is going to be hopefully really informative. And before jumping in, I have to do a obligatory shameless plug of my new book. First things first, thanks so much for everyone who has bought this book recently. We've got quite a few orders over the past week since we did our last live stream, and I super appreciate the support. This is the new book that I made called Home Gardener's Guide to Korean Natural Farming. Appreciate you guys supporting the work that we do on this channel, exploring these incredible techniques. And Bokashi, the way that I do it now, is largely reliant on a lot of the Korean natural farming inputs that I teach how to make on this channel and in the book. So if you want to check that out and support the channel, that'd be great. And send me a review if you have bought the book electronically, the ebook, I should say. And if you bought it on Amazon, please leave a 5-star review and and say some nice things about it. And I'll read that on maybe a live stream sometime. So appreciate that support. So for this stream, I'm streaming from a new location. This is the house that we just got to move back to. So I'm nice and frazzled mentally, but I'm going to be engaged here because I'm excited to talk about this. But if I seem a little bit disorganized, more than usual even, that's why, because we're like moving in, and moving is terrible for anyone, but it's especially terrible when you have 3 kids who are repacking the boxes that you're unpacking and doing crazy stuff. So, so there you go. So I'll start off with with just kind of an overview explanation of Bokashi, what it is. We'll talk through some maybe of the more advanced stuff and some of the potential for Bokashi. And then I've got a couple experiments that I just checked on today that I'll get to talk about a little bit. And then, of course, we'll answer questions. So Bokashi is something that I think almost guaranteed, if you were to say the word Bokashi in just normal life, no one would know what you're talking about, except for maybe if you're in Japan. But I've talked to Japanese people about it, and they've never heard of it, too. So it's probably not like a fully ubiquitous thing across the globe, or at least in Japan, similar to America. So Bokashi is the Japanese word, though, for fermented organic matter. And so what we're talking about when it comes to Bokashi is fermentation. And fermentation is incredible. Actually, if you're tuning in now, comment where you're coming from or stream, like joining this stream from. And also just tell me if you've fermented anything in your life. Some of the best foods in the world, maybe the best foods arguably, come from fermentation. So we're going to talk about I want to talk a little bit about fermentation to start, because it's kind of the framework, the starting point for everything when it comes to Bokashi. 2 books that have been highly influential and informative for me on this topic, I've got them with me, are The Art of Natural Cheese Making by David Asher. This book is incredible. You really sense his passion and interest in the topic, and he's done a substantial amount of research on making cheese in traditional ways, but also just it's a hugely informative resource as far as like culturing and using microorganisms to ferment food. And so his primary source of that culture is kefir. It's an incredible resource that I would really recommend checking out. I think he has another book now too that I have yet to buy, but That's a great book. David Asher is the man. And then the other book that I was introduced to more recently is the Noma Guide to Fermentation. Similar in some ways and different in others than the Art of Natural Cheesemaking. This is written by Renee Redzepi and David Zilber, and who they did a lot of fermentation stuff at the Noma restaurant back when it was open, and they still do fermentation. I think they do pop-ups around the world. And so this is a thick book. This is like a tome of sorts. A lot of really interesting stuff in here about fermenting food specifically, but it's actually really informed my gardening practice, which is wild because, like I said, like the best foods in the world are fermented, which we'll talk about a little bit, but also compost is a fermented thing. And indigenous microorganisms are, when you're culturing them, you're fermenting. And the soil is fermented in a lot of ways by just basic definitions of fermentation. So there's a couple main types of fermentation, and there's so many types of fermentation, but two that I'll kind of categorize right now are aerobic and anaerobic fermentation. And this will become relevant when we talk about what's happening with Bokashi, because it's kind of it's a little bit complicated exactly where it fits in. So there's more anaerobic ferments, I would say, I think food-wise, probably, than aerobic, but there are plenty of aerobic examples of fermentation. So coffee beans or coffee seed pods are aerobically fermented before they get processed and roasted to be made into coffee. Tea leaves are aerobically fermented before they're used to be steeped in water and drunk as tea. And then there's many others that are escaping me. I think that koji has an aerobic fermentation quality to it. And then on the other side, we've got the anaerobic ferments. And this is like probably most ferments. I've actually got some with me as an example. So I do kefir, and I mean, raise your hand in the comments if you do kefir. This stuff is the elixir of life next to kombucha, which I also do. But I love kefir because these kefir grains, I should have actually taken some out to show you, but they're like these little scobies. They kind of look like cauliflower. And they ferment milk into a really digestible form that's not only digestible, but it just aids in overall gut health. Like supremely powerful microbes and probiotics in kefir, in my opinion. I use it to culture my yogurt. I make yogurt at home, and it makes a really nice, tangy, beautiful yogurt as well. And so super recommend kefir. That is an anaerobic fermentation process primarily because it's happening in milk. It's just fermenting the milk, similar to how we kind of very similar how we make LAB in Korean natural farming, which we'll get into. Another example of an anaerobic ferment would be like wine or beer making. So all these alcoholic ferments do that. Then we've also got things like sauerkraut. This is my spicy kraut that I'm working on right now. It's super delish, and basically we'll touch on this a little bit more. This is one of the ways that you can culture. So for something like kefir, the culture is what is transforming the environment and kind of curating the environment so that the milk can ferment and basically, create a stable culture. For the sauerkraut, there are lactic acid bacteria and different cultures present on the cabbage, but without salt to select out the kind of potentially bad microbes that could get in the way. If you were to just like put cabbage in water, it'll start to putrefy and smell nasty. But if you just salt it, it draws out moisture from the cabbage. You guys probably all know this if you fermented anything, and it draws out moisture, and then it creates its own brine that's a salty brine, and that limits bad bacteria and fungi and other microbes, yeasts, from developing, and it just keeps the lactic acid bacteria locked in. Again, I promise this will become relevant as we talk about bokashi. One more. This is a very simple. So this one is a actually the jar is super cloudy, but these are just some simple lacto-fermented radishes that I made. Super tasty. You just slice them up, dice them, and they make a great topping for, like, I don't know, a burrito bowl or something, or salad or whatever you want to eat. Kind of just tangy, and got a little bit of spice from the radish. Good texture. Anyway, so much fun stuff with fermentation. I'll check in and see. Argos, so glad to hear that you use kefir daily. And for the dog, yeah, totally. We don't have a dog right now, but we give kefir grain, like excess kefir grains, to our chickens. I've fed kefir to our cats a lot before. And yeah. So guys, thanks for tuning in. If you haven't yet, share where you're coming from. Toronto, Canada. That's awesome. San Francisco. What's up, Teats Treats? Glad to have you back. And Colombia. Woo! Sweet. That's awesome. Okay. All right. So, okay, we got anaerobic and aerobic fermentation. And then we've kind of got some that do both, really, like vinegar making. If you guys have seen our vinegar video, one of our least popular, actually, recent ones. But still very interesting topic. It's actually both. It starts off anaerobic, where the sugars are consumed by yeast. And that whole process needs to happen without oxygen. And then you get cider, or if you're doing it with grapes, you get wine. And then at that point, if you want to keep it wine, you need to limit the amount of oxygen that touches the surface of the liquid, because where the oxygen, like if it's oxygenated, it starts to the acetic acid bacteria start to take over the fermentation or the ferment, and and those thrive on oxygen. So once you switch from, like, you've made your alcohol and then you're moving toward vinegar, the vinegar process is more of an aerobic fermentation process. And that's why in the video that we released, I kind of show you guys how if you just constantly aerate your apple cider, for instance, with a fish tank bubbler, you can get finished vinegar in like a week. It's crazy. And I learned that from this book, not my own technique. This is what I learned from David Zilber and Renee Redzepi. Kombucha is also a similar process. I believe the yeasts early on, they feed on the sugars, and then the acetic acid in the kombucha and the lactic acid ferment that further. And that's sort of it's kind of a dual anaerobic and aerobic fermentation process. So I kind of alluded to this already, but if you, there's kind of two main ways that food is cultured or cultures its environment, I guess. And so what we need to do is select for beneficial microbes that can digest and process the materials that they're given to eat. And so, like is the case for sauerkraut, salt, or the lacto-fermented radishes, salt is the thing that is limiting bad bacteria from entering the scene, and then the healthy, mostly lactic acid bacteria can establish. And these are going to contain unique lactic acid bacteria or lactobacilli species, subspecies, compared to something like this, which is my LAB, my Korean natural farming input. That's cultured rice wash water that I fed milk and strained off. You guys probably have made that. And it's brown because of the sugar, in case you haven't made it and you're wondering why my whey is brown. That's brown sugar. So fermented food scraps. this is where Bokashi comes in. Is it aerobic or is it anaerobic? And the question is, it is anaerobic, but it's complicated. And this is an interesting one. I think that this is a pretty common question that I've got on Bokashi, because the question is, so this is not my Bokashi bucket, but it has my Bokashi brand in it. I'll just use this as an example. So this is like kind of what my buckets look like. So you have two of these buckets, and you fill up the top one with food scraps. You inoculate it with Bokashi brand or with the LAB spray, and then it's got holes punctured into the bottom, and moisture drips out, hopefully into a second bucket that is going to catch the moisture, or you can put it in a drain spout and do it that way. And so the food scraps in here are getting cultured, but they're also getting condensed, and the moisture gets pressed out of them. And so this is kind of like, the effect is almost like if you were to stack newspaper, and or I guess even just like a book. Like if you were to have like these pages in the book, and then you soaked it with water and ruined it, and then wrung out the water, it's going to be kind of compressed and wet, but not really, it's not like dripping. Like it'll be wet to the touch, but it's not going to make your hands wet. And but the moisture is kind of limiting the oxygen in that environment. And so it is a oxygen depleted environment, making it anaerobic, but it's not a saturated, fully like soaked saturated environment, like something like kefir or like sauerkraut. So sauerkraut, this is done fermenting, so pop it in the fridge. But when it was fermenting, all of the cabbage needs to stay submerged in the brine. Otherwise, the stuff that's on top, the aerobic bacteria, yeasts, and whatnot, are going to start to build up on the surface. And that's kind of the danger zone. But if you can keep it submerged in the salt brine, it's going to be good. The thing with Bokashi, the reason that you don't want it submerged is because we're not adding salt to the food scraps. At least I'm not. And when you don't add salt in a 2% salt brine, then you run the risk of pathogenic microbes taking hold and establishing and putrefying the food, like I already kind of talked about. So those are the two kind of main ways. You can inoculate your materials with a culture, or you can add salt to limit the bad bacteria. But you have to have one or the other. And then if you're going to have, in the case of Bokashi, we're inoculating our food scraps with that lactic acid bacteria culture. And then if it's soaked to the top, like soaked to the all the way through, then it still allows for kind of the nasty putrefying bacteria and fungi to take over, and the molds to really take root. And so if that happens, then it's going to just create a disbalance in the culture, and then it won't decompose as quickly in the soil, which is where the whole thing is heading. If you aren't familiar with Bokashi, that is the goal, is to actually utilize this waste stream that would otherwise go in the garbage and build soil out of it. And you can use Bokashi food scraps in a couple of main ways. I would say the first, to finish the process, I should say, you compress your food scraps into your Bokashi bucket while culturing them, drain off the leachate, the moisture that's going to come out of them. And then once that bucket is filled, you got to let it ferment for 2 weeks so that the culture can fully inoculate and ferment the food scraps. Once that's done, they're ready to be used. And the way that they can be used is by burying them directly into soil, or by using them in a compost heap, or you can mix them with other, you can mix them like with your potting mix, or you can put them into an aerobic digester. There's a lot of options, but all paths lead to the soil. And that's why it's incredible, because it makes really good soil. It's organic material, and it's also got the healthy cultures in there. And so what happens to the lactic acid bacteria when we introduce it to the soil, which is largely aerobic, it's got anaerobic pockets, but it's largely aerobic, is that the lactic acid bacteria, they're not strict anaerobes. They are technically facultative anaerobes, which means that they can do both. They can kind of establish in anaerobic conditions, but then they can also, when they're introduced to oxygen, they can adapt and survive. And that's kind of the gist. So basically, when they get introduced to the soil, though, the lactic acid bacteria will alter themselves, and then other soil microbes will join the party. And they're basically joining in, if you call it a meal for microbes, they're joining in the meal when it's fully ready to actually like consume. I don't know. I'm workshopping this in real time. It's like I don't know. It's like the mama bird chewed up the worm and food debris and then is feeding the baby birds. And that's what the lactic acid bacteria. The lactic acid bacteria are the mama birds. And they're processing meat and dairy for the baby bird soil microbes to consume. So huge potential here for with Bokashi for getting rid of food waste. If you have kids, you know that they just they waste so much food. And I try to catch, like sort of 5-second rule. If they like swipe something off the table, I try and scoop it up and save it for later or something for them. But a lot of the time, after meals, you just find so much food on the ground, which is disheartening, but it gets better if you can turn it into soil. That's the way I see it, at least. So, okay, I'm going to take a quick pause because I think there might be a couple questions. Ted G-Man coming in from North Mississippi. Welcome. Hey, thanks for ordering the books. Appreciate that. And Chris Murphy, now they got Peruvian rainforest microbes. What do you mean by that? Got Peruvian rainforest microbes. Sounds cool. Our goals, so Bokashi pre-compost won't attract animals, even thick pieces of meat. Yeah, great question. It has not happened in my experience. And this is interesting. So part of what's happening here too, I should say, when you're inoculating your food scraps with your lactic acid bacteria cultures, is that they're acidifying the materials. So they're, high acid materials, kind of like vinegar is like a natural pest deterrent, or like if you spray it, some people spray it to like detract rodents or animals or something. But Bokashi fermented food scraps are really, don't taste them to try and find out, but they're really sour. They kind of smell sour, pickly. And they're not attractive to rodents in my experience. I've never had any animals dig them up out of my compost pile. They decompose very quickly in hot compost piles. And I just checked out some that I had buried a couple months ago, actually, in the soil in our front yard. And they were completely undisturbed for that time. They weren't even buried that deep. So, yeah. Chris Murphy, censorship. Oh, maybe YouTube blocked my previous. Maybe I just missed it. I didn't see it. Censorship around ferments conversations. Interesting. Yeah, well, continuing, so what's really interesting to me about, and this is something that I've kind of like picked up on, I guess, from these two books that I showcased, The Art of Natural Cheese Making and the Noma Guide to Fermentation. both of these food preparers, chefs, people, they experiment with wild fermentation, natural microbes kind of from the area and that they're growing in or raising livestock in, culturing their food in. And what happens in those processes is that, or I guess what I've learned from them is that the microbes, when you feed them new food, they adapt very quickly to basically be able to process and digest and ferment that food. And so the way that microbes, the way that they adapt and they multiply, their genetic makeup is constantly almost in flux based on what they need to be able to consume for energy. And so also, that being said, some under certain conditions, like anaerobic conditions, kind of like with lactic acid bacteria, what I was talking about before, when it becomes exposed to oxygen, then it adapts so that it can live in that oxygen present environment. But it also cultures in anaerobic conditions, which is lacking oxygen. So I was wondering about, I know that there's lots of lactic acid bacteria in indigenous microorganisms, specifically my IMO4, and then also in my shelf-stable Jadon microbial solution. So I did an experiment with 4 different Bokashi buckets. I had one that I was using EM1 spray, which is the kind of traditional, I think that's the stuff you can buy. And I think it was the spray, it wasn't the brand. It was just you can buy the effective microorganisms 1 spray. So I cultured 1 bucket with that. I cultured 1 bucket with my own personal lactic acid bacteria spray. And then I did 1 bucket with shelf-stable Jadon microbial solution and then IMO4. And I buried them all. And then it was kind of an interesting timing here. If you've seen any of our recent videos about our housing situation, we own this house that we just moved into, but then we had tenants who were living here, and we had some access to the property a few months back, like in early September, but then we kind of lost access to the property for a stretch there. And so now, anyway, point is now we're back, and I got to check on the Bokashi experiment and just looked at it today. I apologize for my lack of technological know-how or just lack of preparation here. I was going to try and actually just showcase it through my phone, but I haven't figured out yet how to do the live stream from both places. I'm sure that there are many ways to do that, but so you'll just take my word for it. We'll probably come out with a short or something showcasing it. But I buried these different Bokashi inoculated food scraps in various places in the yard nearby, and they all decomposed into soil. I just dug up. The one that I could find any remnants from was like some whole chicken thighs that had just gone bad. They expired in my fridge, unfortunately, and there was a whole chicken thigh that I had just pressed down into my Bokashi bin, and it was raw. And so that hasn't fully decomposed, but it actually has like dehydrated substantially in the soil and is probably going to be gone, I would imagine, by springtime. So the other thing is, and I think I caught this comment, our goals, do bones get soft? They do get soft, but we'll talk about bones in a sec. I think it's probably not like the absolute best way to treat bones. You can do it, but there's probably better ways. And I'll touch on that if I remember. Again, thanks for bearing with me. And we're in the process of moving. And so my preparation is limited. So we'll show what those different soils yielded. My point is, with the different cultures from the IMO4, the microbial solution, the EM1, the lactic acid bacteria. I think that using IMO4 and JMS is totally viable for inoculating your food scraps and doing it kind of in that Bokashi style, because the different bacteria, lactic acid bacteria that's present in those cultures, the fermented ingredients, emerges and helps to decompose your food scraps, or it helps to pre-ferment them rather, so that they can then be decomposed by soil microbes. Interesting stuff, to me at least. Chris Murphy, how's your farmland doing? We have like just moved back the beginning of this past week. And so we're still unpacking thoroughly. I've got, you can't see in the room around me. This is one of our new home offices, but there's boxes everywhere and it's stressful. So the farmland itself, it has been untended to for a couple of years. And so there's weeds everywhere. It's very, it's just basically has been fallow. I think that maybe one of our renters planted a few plants, but it's got a bit of work. So yeah, anyway. Chris, you also said RFK announced increased funding for regenerative agriculture through EQIP and CSP USDA programs. That's sweet. I'll have to look into that because we could use some funds. That's sweet. So actually, I'll just hop back to bones real quick, because that is, I think, a legitimate question about what to do if you want to put bones in your Bokashi. I'd say that there's maybe a couple rules. So size, definitely the size of the bone is important to keep in mind. Like for small chicken bones, like chicken wings, I think that those would probably decompose not like fairly well. I'd say that chicken drumsticks, probably you might want to let it ferment a bit longer. At least that's what I've found in my experience. Fermenting them a bit longer helps, seems like. And then really the main thing I think for that helps my bones actually eventually decompose would be that I'm using them for bone broth. So I always save my bones for my chickens, obviously, and then I buy knuckle bones for like beef knuckle bones to make my bone broth. So those get really broken down. And then what you could do after that is that you could make a vinegar extraction to make your water soluble calcium phosphate. And so they further get processed. And then you can Bokashi compost them, or you can burn them in your biochar if you're actually making charcoal. I'd say for thick bones, you want to break them with a hammer if you can. It gets a little messy, which is why I usually don't do that. But you can, if you can smash them up a bit and grind them, then they're much more likely to decompose in the soil once they've been fermented. But long story short, I think bones are, in my experience, maybe just not quite the best suited. What I really like to do, and I'll do this next growing season, is I will let I do black soldier fly larvae for my chickens, and that's kind of another way of offloading food waste. But black soldier fly larvae will just clean bones very thoroughly. And if you crack them open for them, they'll eat out the marrow and all of that. And so that's one way to kind of yield some very clean bones. And then you can do whatever you want. You can burn them, you can ferment them, crush them, all of that. Yep. Fallow for 3 years makes it eligible for organic farming certification. Cool. Right on. And Chris, you said, I cut my chicken bones with a cleaver the long way for my bone broth. Yeah, nice. One question that we'd gotten from the post that I made about this, from SF 1883, recently started making Bokashi and some batches were classical, well-made Bokashi, white fuzz on top. Others were mixed, white and gray. I think because I left the liquid at the bottom too much time on the bucket, or because I used a bucket that wasn't airtight. And the last one had no fuzz at all. I read it. It wasn't bad if it didn't smell bad, but that result was shocking. I'd love to know how to assess if my Bokashi is well fermented or not. Thanks. So, okay, so SF, I think you're talking about the fermenting the actual food scraps themselves. So on the surface, if you leave your Bokashi for a while, and even if it is sealed airtight, in my experience, there's usually some white fuzz or gray fuzz on the top. And I've even had some green and blue fuzz on the surface of my food scrap buckets. And I think that as the smell is kind of the main thing that I really look for to see if it's gone bad. If it smells putrid, nasty, or I don't know, rotting food, poopy, then that's kind of the indication that the fermentation went bad. That's the best one that I've seen. I think that if there's mold on top but not throughout the food scraps, because they compress, and then if you're pulling them apart and there's not going to be any fuzz in there, I think and it smells good, I think it's probably fine. What's interesting is that there's different smells. Like when I culture my food scraps with EM1, then I'd say the smell is it's almost savory and pickly for sure. But it's got this kind of umami, I don't know, savory scent. And then when I make my own Bokashi brand, at least this stuff that I work with right now with lactic acid bacteria, it smells grapefruity. And I mean, I don't know. I think that as long as it smells kind of sour, you're probably on the right track. And I think that that's answering your question. You're just saying your classical, well-made Bokashi, white fuzz on the top, and then others were mixed. And so even you do need to strain out the liquid from your buckets so that it doesn't build up and start to putrefy the lower levels in the bucket. But otherwise, if it smells all right, then I think it's probably fine. I usually have some residual liquid at the bottom, and it doesn't seem to disrupt the fermentation when I compost it. Wreck-It Ralphie, thanks for asking this question. You said, I've fermented Bokashi bran many times, sometimes over a month, with no hyphae. Is this normal? I've also experimented with adding nutrients in with it, kelp meal, alfalfa, azomite, oyster shell, etc. What are your thoughts? So if you're fermenting your Bokashi bran, and I guess I'll just briefly mention how that kind of what that process looks like. But you're almost doing the exact same process that you try to accomplish for fermenting your food scraps, but with a wheat bran or a rice bran or oat bran, whatever you got. And then you're going to inoculate that with lactic acid bacteria. And something you were saying was that you use other inputs like azomite and stuff, which is what I have really started to enjoy doing as well. We made a video on this, kind of showing a couple additions you can make. Right now I just culture my Bokashi bran with lactic acid bacteria, fermented plant juice, fermented fish amino acids, azomite, and a little bit of sea salt. Sorry to bother people with the sea salt, hot topic. And the ratio there though is, let me see if I can actually copy paste this into I don't know if this is gonna copy paste into the chat. No, it's not. You can see the video. It's 40 parts water, 2 parts lactic acid bacteria, 1 part FPJ, 1 part fermented fish amino acids, 1/4 part azomite, and 1/10 of a part sea salt. So for example, it would be 600 grams of water, 30 grams of LAB, 15 grams FPJ and FAA, 3 grams of azomite, and 1 gram of sea salt. And then once you mix that up, that's what you use to saturate your wheat bran. And that cultures for 2 weeks to a month, less time in warmer temperatures, longer and colder. And just to get back to the question there. So yeah, so as far as if you were to see hyphae in that, you actually probably will not expect to see any fungal hyphae in your Bokashi bran. Because we're dealing with bacteria, and to my knowledge, actinomycetes are the only thing that produce something that resembles hyphae. Otherwise, it's just going to have the smell, and then maybe there will be like some color, but you really don't want any colors on it. You just want it to smell fresh, and in my case, grapefruity, but maybe pickly for you. So yeah, so if you don't see any white hyphae or any colored hyphae, that's totally good. That's probably a good sign. And then if you're experimenting with adding different nutrients to it, like kelp meal, alfalfa, azomite, oyster shell, that sounds great. That's like a great way to kind of add in passive, I don't know, like add in extra nutrients that, especially if you're composting that'll go straight in your compost pile. That was a little long-winded. Teeth Treats, thank you so much for the donation. So kind of you. Appreciate you. Bokashi isn't on my radar at all, but I believe in your knowledge. Keep the lives alive. Okay, will do. I'm gonna get better. This is just how I learn. I like to do things in real time, and so I appreciate all of you guys who have joined and are watching now and watched previously and are going to watch in the future. Thanks for supporting this. And yeah, and I'll get better on the technology, and maybe I'll be able to showcase different things that I'm working on out in the yard in real time. That would be cool. Yes. So guys, post if you are still watching and you have any questions, go ahead and post them there. Hopefully this was moderately helpful or interesting to check out. I like love fermentation so much, and I really love just like food. And so that's why like one of the main reasons that I do all of this. I think that there's some really in the book that I was talking about, the Noma Guide to Fermentation, in the intro, they're talking about another chef, David Chang. You guys might be familiar with him. He's kind of somewhat of a celebrity chef, and he talks about the concept of microbial terroir. And terroir, I touch on this actually in my book, A Home Gardener's Guide to Green Natural Farming. And there's just this really interesting, promising, an interesting promise when it comes to curating the microbial qualities of your growing space. And then basically, I mean, what's happening, like if your soil is properly fermented, and it contains all those wonderful microorganisms and beneficial bacteria and fungi, then the plants that you're pulling out of the ground or picking off of the trees are going to retain those microbes at some level. And then, and that's going to affect their flavor and their quality. And it's going to affect the way that the flowers express themselves in their petals. And then when you take it even a step further and ferment those foods that are coming out of this microbially rich soil, and there's yeasts floating through the air and all sorts of amazing processes that we're not even aware of that are happening in your little microclimate. Any food that you take from that land and ferment is just going to retain so much of that microbial terroir and create these unique foods. And a unique expression of the land that's taken from. That's like, I mean, long term, something that Cassidy and I are really looking forward to just diving into and just seeing what is the impact of really accommodating to and prioritizing the microbial conditions of our growing space. You know, what kind of food and flowers are we going to be able to yield long term? What does this mean for, you know, if we could shepherd or put sheep on pasture somewhere and be applying these inputs and getting sheep's milk and then making cheese out of that. Like, what does that cheese taste like from sheep that are eating pasture that's been sprayed with indigenous microbes and all of that. Anyway, that was a little bit. My head is in the clouds. But yeah. Let me see if there's anything else I was going to touch on here. I think that this is pretty much what I had planned for today, as far as like talking about Bokashi, and I hope that kind of cleared up for anyone who's wondering about what's the process. You know, is this an anaerobic ferment? A lot of people asked about, like, why does it matter if the food scraps aren't submerged in water or are. So hopefully that cleared up that for anyone who's watching this. Yeah, guys, I'm gonna call it there. Teach Treats, thanks again for the donation. Chris Murphy, Argles, thank you for joining as always. Ted G Man, Gabrielle Lago, Lago, Lexington, and everyone else. Thank you guys. Makes it worth it. Teach Treats, he said, I'm totally cool with the level of technology here. I want to learn and I'm not worried about technological difficulties. Yeah. Yep. Okay. All right. Thank you guys. I'll see you next week. We'll be back. I think we're streaming next week. I'm probably going to skip the Christmas week. So I'll be back on the 20th, and topic TBD. Let me know. Oh, what's up, SF? Thank you you said, thanks very much for answering my question. I think Bokashi has enormous potential. Dude, thanks for your support. You were like one of the most frequent commenters on this channel. So nice every single time. So thanks for thanks for joining. And yeah, guys, ask, tell me what topics you want covered in these more conversational environments, and I would love to do that. So, all right, we'll see you guys next week.